Okay, so let's keep working on our carousel. And I'm gonna start by actually nicely formatting these buttons here, just so that they look like these two here. All right, so basically making them white and round and the icon green and giving it some shadow. So let's have that here. Let's add some comment here like the controls. And so we want our button here. So first of all, the background color was, remember, white. Okay. And then since this is actually a button, it has by default a border that we need to remove. So that's a problem we run into before. And so the trick is always to set border to none. And so then it actually disappears completely. But let's set that back. So here we can simply define some height and some width. Let's say 40. I think that's part of our list here. Well, actually not. But let's cheat here in this case and use the value that's between 32 and 48. So we need to do that so that it looks more like the actual example. And with 40 pixels as well. So there we go. And finally, we can see actually the icons now as well, but they are very small. So we need to change that. And here they are called button icon. So button icon. And again, we will go with a height and width of 24 pixels. And there we go. Nice. Now, the fact that they are actually not squared, so basically that the width property is not being respected, is the fact that they are right now flex items. And so remember, the width works a little bit differently there. So right now, the browser is trying to fit all this content here into the flex container, and so it will automatically shrink these items here, even though we set a width of 40 pixels. So if we actually want to see the real result, we should now take them out of this flex container. And the way in which we will do that is by actually positioning them absolutely. All right, so I will show you a little bit later why we do it that way. But for now, let's just do that. So position, absolute. And so remember, by doing that, we take the element completely out of the flow of the page, right? So for the surrounding elements, it is as if these elements were no longer on the page. And so then basically only these two elements here remain as flex items. All right, so that's very important to remember about absolute positioning. And another thing that's very important to remember is that we need to specify inside of which container these elements should actually be absolutely positioned. So in relation to what parent the absolute positioning is going to happen. And remember that we need to basically choose a parent element and set that one to position relative. All right. So in this case, that is pretty obvious, right? So the element that should be the parent of these two here is this entire carousel. So it is inside of that we want the absolute positioning to happen. So we need to do this, even though it is, of course, already the parent. But we still need to do this. Okay, let's see what happens now. And there we go. So now they are finally back to being squared, even though they are, of course, still not exactly in the position where we want them to be. But we will worry about that later. For now, let's finish formatting them. And so we want them to be round, and therefore, let's use a border radius with a really high value. Or actually, since they are squared, remember we can simply say 50%, and that will then make them round as well. Then here we want actually this to have a color. So this icon, again, we use the stroke property. All right, and there we go. And then it looks as if this icon here is not really centered inside the button, but we can actually fix that quite easily because this element here is a child element. And so we can actually use this nice trick of simply setting this to a flex container and then align items to center it horizontally or actually vertically, and justify items or justify content, of course, and center as well. And so now that is nicely centered. So as we saw here, Flexbox is even very helpful when there is only one flex element. So one flex item. So in the button, of course, there is only one element. But still, in order to vertically center that, the easiest way is to declare the parent element as a flex container and then center it both horizontally and vertically like this. All right, but now comes the time where we actually want to position these two elements. So this one here should go to the right and then a little bit outside of it, and the other one to the left, right? So actually we need two different classes for each of them so we can position them separately. So this one is, this is one button. So let's give it here simply another class. So a variation of button, which is button left. That's why I like to use these two dashes there. And then button right, like this. Okay. Actually, let's do it after the real button. So let's start by saying left 0, and then on the other one we say right 0. Okay, so that looks good already. And for some reason they are already vertically centered, but let's pretend they are not. Okay, so probably that is because of this flex container. Let's see. So they are still in a way flex items, even though they are absolutely positioned. And so if we no longer would align these items vertically, then you see that they would actually also move to another position. So for now, as we implement the technique that I want to show you next, let's leave it like this. All right. So let's go back to these buttons, because now I'm going to explain you and to show you a brand new technique that we use in CSS all the time, actually. And so this one has to be with absolute positioning and also kind of with centering at the same time. So to start, let's go back here to see what we actually want, which is these two buttons here to be exactly vertically centered, and even more importantly, also exactly centered here, basically on this line. So on this transition. All right. So how can we do that? And let's actually first focus on the vertical centering using absolute positioning. Okay. So we might think that we could vertically center this element simply by setting the position here to 50%. So actually the top. So here in the top property, remember that we can specify the distance basically from the top. And so we can do also that in percentages. So for example, we could specify 10%, and then that would look like this. However, we can also specify 50%. And so as I was just saying, we might think that since 50% is like half of 100%, that this might then vertically center this element. So let's take a look. And well, it kind of does, but it also doesn't. And the reason for that is that basically 50% is exactly half of the width of the parent container. And so that's from here to here. but that is only the start of the element. So the element starts right here, but basically we would like the center of the element to be here in the center, right? But that probably sounds a bit confusing, so let me actually show you now a visual representation of this technique. So this is our starting position, where we have the carousel with the position set to relative and the button left with the position set to absolute, right? And so now, as we just did, we set the position to 50%. And so what that does is to move this element by exactly 50% of the parent container's height. All right. So for example, if the carousel had a height of 600 pixels, then this button would have moved down 300 pixels. So exactly 50% of the parent container. And this is really important. Okay. However, as we see here, what it did was to basically move the top of the element exactly to the middle, but not the element itself. And so that's where the second part of this technique comes in. So this technique of vertically centering with absolute positioning. And so that second part is by using the transform property once again. Now, in this case, we use transform not with scale, but with translating. And what translate does is to basically move the element around. Now, here we can specify the x value, which is basically horizontally, and the y value, which is the second one, and so that is vertically. And in this example, I set that to minus 50%. And why minus 50? Well, because that will basically move the element exactly 50% of its height back to the top. And again, these 50% here in the transform property are actually 50% of the actual element's height, so not of the parent container's height. And that is completely different, okay? And so the result of doing this is that now the element will be exactly centered vertically. So again, the translate property takes two values, where the first one is basically horizontally and the second one is vertically. And so by specifying minus 50% means that the element will move up because of the minus, and it will move up by exactly 50% of its actual height. And so by doing this, after the second step, it will be completely centered vertically. All right. So I hope that made sense, especially with this animation, and maybe we can play that again. So we start here, which will move the element down here. So again, 50% of the parent container's height. Then we add the translate, as I just explained, which will move it back 50%. Okay? And so let's now go back to code and actually implement this. Okay, so here we are back, and actually let's put this here in the button left so that we don't get too confused. Okay, so that looks the same, but now let's go back to our transform property. So transform, and remember, now we don't use scale like we did before, but we use translate. And here, again, we set the first one to 0 by now, which is horizontally, and then vertically, we want minus 50% for the reasons that I just explained to you. And so take a look at this button now, and there we go. Now it is vertically centered using this absolute positioning technique. Great, so that's beautiful, but you might be wondering why we didn't simply use the power of Flexbox for this. And the reason is that, well, we actually don't want this to be a flex element. That's the first thing. The second thing is that sometimes we actually want to position an element absolutely like this, and then it is important that you know this technique. And third is because actually we want to use translate also horizontally, right? Because in this case, if we simply used Flexbox, then actually this wouldn't work. First, because remember, it created all those extra gaps for all of these elements that we did not want. And then also because it would be impossible to place these elements basically outside of the container. which is exactly what we're going to do now, right? So what I mean here is that this translate, of course, is not only vertically, but also horizontally. So we can specify a value here. So let's experiment first with some other value, let's say 10 pixels, just so you see how it works. And so what happens is that it moved 10 pixels to the side, right? But what if we set it to 50%? Well, then basically it will move half of its own width to the right side. So that's almost what we want, but we want it to move to the left side, right? And so we say minus 50%, and there you go. Now it is exactly where we want it to be. So right in the center here, basically vertically centered with this border here. So this end of the element. And to make that even more visible, let's add some box shadow here. Okay, so vertically 12 pixels. Then let's blur it 24. And once again, I'm just using these here very quickly. And with experience, this will become easier for you. All right. And so now we can see that beautifully, right? It is really exactly at the center. Now, we could, of course, also have done it completely without the transform. So if we did this, of course, it would look like this. And we could then try to guess these values here kind of manually. But the problem is that, again, these top and left values are not in relation to the element itself, but to the parent element. So that is really one of the main takeaways of this lecture. So in relation to parent element, so I'm actually writing that down here for you, and this is in relation to element itself. And so here we could now like say minus 125 pixels or something. And in this case, we do actually know the width of these elements. So we could have said like minus 20 pixels, and then that would have worked. But usually that is actually not the case. So that is oversimplifying it. So usually we would have to mess here manually with some pixels or even with some percentage, which is even worse, like 3%, for example. And then that is too much. So we would try 2%, which is not enough. And so, yeah, this is not a good idea. It is better to put these to some default like 0 and 50, and then use this. All right. Then here we need the same transform in the button right, but in the opposite direction. So of course we need this top here as well. So let's put that, well, let's copy it just so it's a bit easier for you to understand. But we could also have simply put it here into the button, which is the class that both of them have in common. But anyway, now it looks like this. And so in this case, we actually want it to move to the right. And so here, this value needs to be positive. Okay, and there it is. So we have our buttons here completely positioned in the exact position where we wanted them to be. And so once again, that is a perfect use case for absolute positioning. Now let's turn this back on. So to put the text back to where it was. And also we need some, we want the cursor here to be a mouse on these buttons. So that's something I forgot. And it's a trick that we already used before. So cursor set to pointer. All right. So that looks almost the same. It is a little bit different, but that's, well, because we used some different values. But what matters is that we are still missing these dots here. So these are basically also buttons, and they are located also outside of this container. All right. So if it's outside of its own container, that looks again as if we will need some absolute positioning here. right? And so let's go ahead and now code this part very quickly. So right here at the very end, where these controls start, let's add some container element, let's say some div, which I'm going to call the dots. And then let's put 4 button elements in there. So for these 4 elements. So the button with a class of dot. And now what should we put in here? Well, we can simply leave it empty, but usually it's a better practice to create an empty space. So something that looks like this, but remember that HTML actually ignores empty spaces like this. So instead of writing an empty space like this, it is a common technique to use an HTML entity for that. And that entity, so that entity that represents the empty space, is NBSP, like this. So you see it here, it's a non-breaking space. That's what NBSP means. All right, so again, that's just in order to not leave this button completely empty, which is not a good idea usually. Okay, copy it 4 times, and then we need dots and dot. Okay, and let's start with these, giving it some height and some width. And the visual styling here is not really important. For me, what matters most at this point is more like the stuff about laying out the elements actually. So again, since this is a button, we need to reset the background color or set it to something. So let's set it to white. And then it looks like we have some border going on here, right? So border, and that is a 2-pixel border, solid and or green. Okay, let's check that out. And here it is. Now we cannot really see the border because it is green. And this whole dots element is of course now yet another flex item, because we didn't yet position it absolutely. But let's do that a bit later and continue styling the dots. So here, let's also make them round with a border radius of 50% and give it the cursor like this. Okay. All right. And now we need to also put them side by side, I guess. Right. So for that, well, actually, let's first position them absolutely. So position absolute. Okay, there they are. And now, of course, we want them to be in the center. So right here, and then at the bottom for now. And so we will now again use the exact same technique that we used before, only it being horizontally this time. But the technique itself works in the exact same way. So what I just explained to you before in that slide. So this time, instead of setting the top to 50%, I will set the left to 50%. So left, 50%. And so that will move basically the start of the element right to the middle of the parent container. Because again, top and left use the dimensions of the parent element as the reference. Okay, but now we use transform and then translate. And now the first value is the horizontal one. And so we move it back 50%, which remember is in relation to itself. All right, and so now it's in the center. Nice. Let's also put it at the very bottom. Bottom 0. There we go. And now let's move it down. And so for that, I really like to use the transform property. So again, I like to put these here like to 0 or to 50% or some really round value like that. And then here we can use translate to position it exactly where we want. So let's say 32 pixels. which is one of our values. And yeah, that looks nice. And so now let's actually put some space between them. And to do that, I will make this a flex container and declare some gap on it. Okay. And if this is all going a little bit too fast for you, especially the constant use of the flex property, then of course feel 100% free to maybe review that part. So maybe the part about flexbox. But anyway, let's now define some quick gap here. 12 pixels. All right, beautiful. And with this, we might be, well, almost done. So the first one here still needs to be green. So let's give the first one a special class. So maybe that's yet another trend that you are starting to see. So that we have one class for everything. And then we have specialized classes, which give some of them basically some additional power. And in this case, that additional power will be that green background color. There we go. And that looks basically the same. Just again, some spacing that's different. The content is also different. But besides that, here we actually need to fix a bit the padding. And I think that's something I mentioned in the beginning. So let's do that. And also that's an opportunity actually to show you something else. So here, of course, we could simply write padding to the right should be like 48 pixels. So that's better. Let's just remove that last word there. I don't like the way that looks. Even this one maybe. Cool. Yeah, but anyway, going back here, this of course works because we set the general padding to 32, then we override the padding on the left to 86, and then we override the padding to the right to 84. However, we can set that all in one go. So remember how the padding property has a shorthand which allows us to set the top and bottom in the first value and the left and right in the second value, right? So like this. So this would be top and bottom and this left and right. However, we can also take that further. So we can specify 4 values, and those 4 values will then be top, right, bottom, and left. So basically clockwise starting at the top. So let me take out all of this and replace it with just one declaration. Again, it starts at the top and then goes clockwise around the 4 borders, basically, the 4 sides of the box. So in the top, we want 32 pixels. On the right, we want 48 pixels. In the bottom, 32 pixels, and left, 48. Give it a save, and that is wrong, because actually on the left, it is 86. So this one here. And so now it is correct. And so now we did actually finish this small project. It was a bit bigger than I thought it would be, but still, I think it was fun and the final result looks fantastic. And we did learn a lot of things here. Actually starting with this. So this is something new. Then we learned how to scale an image. And then finally, we learned this very important technique where we could place an element anywhere that we wanted by using a combination of absolute positioning and transform with translate. So maybe experiment a little bit with the transform property with the translate function. So try different values here for horizontal and vertical placement, and that will then help you solidify this new knowledge. And then I see you back here for our next component, which is going to be a table. And I promise that's going to be a little bit simpler. The next component that we're going to build is a table. So we're going to build a similar table to this one that we saw in our component gallery. So again, this is what our final table will look like. And let's again start by creating a new HTML file. So 03 table.html. And now remember, we will copy the code from this component. So selecting everything and then pasting it here. Then let's also go back here. So to this base URL here, basically. And then we're going to select, oh, actually right here, we need to do that. So we finished our carousel before. Now let's go back. So this here is indeed the base URL. And then here, now we have we need to reload, apparently. So now here is the table. So it's still empty. And so let's get started. And the first thing that I want to tell you is that tables are actually not used a lot anymore in web development. Now, way back in the day, tables actually used to be the first way in which developers built layouts. But now, of course, with Flexbox and CSS Grid, we have way better ways of doing that. However, that being said, tables do still have a place in HTML, especially if we are really trying to represent some data set that can be displayed using a table. And so then the table is the most semantic way of doing that. So let's see how it works in HTML. So we have the table element, and so all starts with that element. So the table element, and then for each of the rows that we want in the table, we use a TR element. So TR stands for table row, right? And then inside of the row, for each column, so basically for each piece of data, we use a TD element. So TD stands for table data. So here in this table, we basically want 4 columns. So just like this. So chair, the laid back, the worker bee, and the chair 4.2, because those are the 4 chair names that we had in the project in the last section. Remember that? And so here, this is basically simply a table which contains some of the information about those chairs. And now the chair 4.2. Let's also create another row right away before we actually see what it looks like in our HTML. And let's actually create another row here before we see the result in the browser. So a second row, and so therefore another TR element here. And then once again, inside of that, 1 TD for each of the pieces of data. So here we want the width. So this row here is all about the width dimension. So 80 centimeters, then here, and this other one has 220 centimeters. Okay, so let's check it out. And well, for now that doesn't look so great, but still we can see that somehow it is a table actually. So this 60, for example, starts right here below the worker bee. So in the same place here. And so it does look like a table already, but of course we will need to style it a lot using CSS. But for now, let's actually finish here and add the other 2 rows. And you see that this is actually a lot of work, writing all this code like this. Here I'm even missing the TD. And if you think about it, we could actually create the exact same thing using CSS Grid, right? So this table that we see here on the right side, you could probably quite easily build that up using CSS Grid. However, again, in many situations, using a table is actually the more semantic way of doing it. So if you really have tabular data, so data that really can be fit into a table like this, then using the right element for the job is many times the best way to go. So even though visually we could create the same thing in another way. But anyway, finishing here our table. We're almost done with that. And of course, we could have just copied this code here, then replaced everything. But, well, as I mentioned in the beginning, actually typing the code is the way that it gets into your brain. Okay, so this is our table. And as I mentioned, we still need to style this a lot using CSS, but let's actually leave that for the next video, because there's still some more things that I want to show you about tables. So right now, all the cells in our table here look basically exactly the same. However, usually in a table, the first row is different. So as we see here in the demo, the first row has this background color and the text is bold, and the same thing here for the first column. So the text is bold, and so it's kind of special and different from the data itself that is right here, right? And we can actually do that using HTML. So basically marking this first column here as being special. And with special, I mean that we can basically tell our HTML that this first row here is the head of the table and the rest of the content is the table's body. So to do that, we can wrap this first row here into the T-head element. So that's table head. And then I will use that trick of using Option or Alt down to move this down. Oh, sorry. And then here we have the T-body. And now let's actually copy this or cut and put it here at the end. And now if we give this a save, then it actually still looks the same because this is only one part of what we need to do. So again, first we declared that this first row here should be the head of the table. And so now semantically, this table makes a lot more sense because it's nicely divided into these more logical sections. So we have the table head and the table body. But if we actually want this cell here to look different, so if we want to mark it as an actual table head, we need to use a different element here also. So here, instead of using TD, we use TH, which is basically a table head cell within this group of cells. So inside of this row here. All right. So let's do that with all of these four. We want all of them to be a table head cell. And so now if we reload, now they look bold and special. All right. And now let's do the same actually with these here. So with the width, depth, and height. And so we can do the same here inside of all the other rows. So this cell right here, we can also declare it as the table head cell of this basically group of cells here. So this row in this case. And so now as we reload, then this one is marked special as well. And so let's do the same here with these two. And with that, we have a nice semantic table, which now makes a lot of sense visually and also in terms of what the code represents. Great. So with that, we finished the HTML markup. Now, there's a lot more things to do with tables in HTML. So things like spanning across multiple rows or multiple columns, but that is not really necessary to learn these days, I believe. So this is more of an overview of how we work with tables, just in case you see one in the wild, because otherwise this code might be quite confusing to you. So like what all these TRs, NTH, and TD here actually mean. And so now you know that it is a table, right? But anyway, let's now go to the next lecture and actually style this table. So now let's style the table that we have been working on. And as always, let's start by giving our component a fixed width and also center it in the viewport. So here I'm going to select the table simply using the element selector of the table. So a width, again, of 800 pixels. And just so we can see this, let's actually also give it some background color. Just for a short amount of time. All right. So you see that now the table got wider, and then these three columns here basically grew in order to fill that empty space. And we can also see that by default, now this text here is centered. So that's because this is a TH element, so a table head cell, because the same we can see here in these four. So these one are now also centered, right? But this column here did not expand like these three did, and that's simply because all of these cells here are table head cells. All right, so now let's center this inside of the viewport, but let's actually use another way. So we have been doing always this trick. So margin something and then auto. And of course, that is going to work here as well. However, I want to start showing you that there are always multiple ways of doing things in CSS. So, can you think of another way of centering our entire page here inside of the viewport? And remember that this viewport that we see here is basically the body. So how could we do this? Well, one way of doing it is to say that the body should be a flex container. So display flex, and there is nothing wrong with that. So the body is just like any other element. So we can also make it a flex container just like any of the other elements. And so now, in order to then center all the flex items, which in this case is just one, remember that we use justify content set to center. And there we go. Now let's just give this here some margin to the top still. All right. Now let's remove this color here. And now I actually want to give this table for now some borders. So we can say border 1 pixel and then solid as always. And let's just use some gray. Well, we can go with this one actually. And so this will add basically a border all around the table. And now let's say we wanted to add borders inside of the whole table. So between all the cells, like in a more traditional table. So between all the rows and all the columns. So to do that, we can simply select all of the table's cells and then add a border around all of them. Now, our cells are these TD elements and also the TH elements, right? So we need to select both of them at the same time here if we want to style them in the same way. And for now, that's what we want to do. And so, as I was saying, let's add some border here of 1 pixel solid and or gray color. And there we go. And that looks a little bit strange, but if we think about it, this result actually makes sense. So each of the cells has a border around it, and so that's why here basically we have two borders very close to each other. Right? Now usually we don't want this to look in this way, and so there is this weird property which is called border collapse. And so basically what we will do here is that when we have two borders close to one another, like we have here, we can make them collapse. So collapse means that these will basically be put together into just one border. So just like this. So see the difference? Before we basically had two borders in the same position. So here, for example, coming from the top of this one and coming from the bottom of this one. And so if we say we want to collapse them, then they are transformed into just one. Now here, let's also add some padding. So 16 top and bottom, 24 left and right, let's say. So that is starting to look more like a real table. And actually we want all of the text here to be aligned to the left. So no centering. And so text align left. Nice. So that is starting to look a little bit like what we have here. Right. But now let's actually get rid of these borders, because in this case we don't want it, but I still wanted to show you how you could add borders in the correct way if you wanted to do that for your own tables at some point. Great. Now remember, what we want to do now is to format this first row here to have this green background color, and the text should also be white. Okay. So how are we going to do that? Well, we somehow need to select basically all of these cells that we have here and format them individually. So we usually never format like an entire row or the head. So instead, what we do is to format the cells themselves. Now these four here are th elements, but we cannot just do this because there are also th elements right here. So inside of the table body. But we just want the ones that are in the table head. And so we can simply do this, right? So a descendant selector selecting only the table head cells that are inside of the actual table head. And so here we can now give them that green background color. And also set the text to white. Okay, so that is starting to look better and better. Now we have this issue that we have kind of these invisible borders here, basically between these cells. And in order to fix that, we actually need to make them disappear by turning this one here back on. So we do, in fact, always need this border collapse here set to collapse. All right. And so now, since we didn't specify any borders, then these invisible borders that we had here before kind of disappeared. Now, if we take a look here at the demo, we see that actually the four columns have the exact same width. So let me show you how we can also do that. And so basically what we need to do is to format the width of these very first cells, so the ones that are in the head, and then the entire table will follow. So it will automatically adjust itself if we say that the width of each of these table head cells, so these four here, should be 25%. So 25% is of course 100% divided by 4. And there we go. All right. And with that, we are almost done. So if we compare it here, it looks almost the same. While the text is a little bit bigger, let's fix that as well. So here we can say that the font size should be 18 pixels. All right. But now what's missing is this very typical table formatting of adding these zebra stripes, which is what we call them. So basically that's having these alternating background colors, which makes the table really easy to read and to scan. Now I noticed that we're kind of missing one of the rows here. So we have the width, depth, and weight, but there's no height. So this second row here is missing somehow. So let's quickly add that. And I will just copy all of this here and paste it down here. And so here, this is height. And 100, 110, and 90. All right. And so this now actually looks exactly the same, except for the zebra stripes. So let's do those zebra stripes. And so let me show you how we can do that. So inside of the T body, we now basically want to select the odd rows and the even ones. So with odd, I mean the row number 1, 3, 5, and so on and so forth. And with odd, we want the second one, the fourth, 6, 8, and so on. And so let's select the TRs inside of the T body, so the table rows. And then remember that we have this very handy nth child pseudo class. So nth child, which remember basically allowed us to select any of the child elements by their order number. So for example, we could do this, select just the third one, and set the background color to red there. And so now the entire third row here would become red. Now, I said previously here that we actually usually select these cells individually, but back here that was basically because I also needed to individually style actually these cells with this width. But we could in fact also have done this. So T hat and then the TR, and here of course there's only one. And so the result would look exactly the same, right? But this styling here of the width of the individual cells will of course need to stay in this selector right here. So in this rule. All right. So again, many times we do format only individual cells, but in this case, where we want to select the row based on the order, we actually need to style rows. All right. And so I think I explained this before, that here we can use a keyword of odd and even. And so the odd ones are now red. So again, that's 1, 3, 5, and so on. And then let's do the same with even. And so here, some other color. And of course, that looks very bad. And so let's get some actual colors again here from open color. And so let's actually use this very, very light gray here for the odd ones. And then some darker tone, maybe this one here, for the even cells. Or the even rows, actually. And yeah, there we go. That's it. Let's compare it. And it is exactly the same one. Great. And so this is the basics of creating and of styling tables with HTML and CSS. Welcome to the coding challenge of this section. So we have built a couple of components together, and so now it's time for you to actually build this component here on your own. So basically this very simple pagination component that you see here on the right side. And this is what the final result should look and work like. So when we hover over these buttons here, they get this green background color, and the same here for each of the pages link. So here I want you to use two buttons, one to go to the previous and one to go to the next page. Then these in here are simply links, so anchor elements. And then we also have these dots here, which is a simple span text element. All right. Now, I don't want you to use any absolute positioning here or anything like that. So these buttons look the same or very similar to the ones that we used in the carousel component. But there we used some absolute positioning, which is not necessary in this case. So we don't have any visual container here. And so this one here is simply going to be the first element and this the last one. All right. Then notice how all of this here is vertically aligned and also how this entire pagination is centered in the browser. All right. And so I think that is enough for the instructions. So please go ahead and try to build this challenge now. And this is probably going to be the hardest challenge of all yet in this course. And so please don't be discouraged in case there is something that you cannot really do. So just try to do all that you can So basically trying your best, because that's, as always, the most important thing. So pause the video now here and then come back for the solution once you're done. Okay, so how did that go? Hopefully you managed to do part of this pagination. And so now here comes the solution in case you missed anything. So let me, as always, get the starter code basically from this component file, then paste that here. Collapse the sidebar. And I will now start here writing the HTML as always. Now here we want a div with the class of pagination. And of course, we need to close that. And then we can immediately start with the first button element here, which will contain this icon. So you could have copied that from the carousel component, or also, of course, here from the hero icons. So that's what I'm doing now. All right. So this one, let's actually give it the class of button, and this one here, button icon. Then let's build our anchor elements. And I didn't mention that these shouldn't point anywhere, but hopefully you figured that one out on your own. So calling these one page links, but of course, you could have called them whatever you liked. Okay. So copy pasting this a couple of times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the last one for page 23. 3, 4, 5, 6, and 23. Okay. And then also here between the 6 and the 23, so basically before the last one, we have some dots. So basically indicating that there are more than 6 pages and in total 23 pages. So that's a common thing to do in a pagination like this. And as I mentioned here, I'm going to use a span element with the class of just dots. And then here, well, the 3 dots. Okay, and let's now take a look here at what it looks like. So we need to reload this usually, and then here we go. So we have the button here, which is again very small, and we're missing actually the last button. So again, that's called btn. And then let's grab this icon here with the class of btn icon. Okay, and now I will copy all of these here, again with the trick of hitting Alt or Option at the same time. And I think that's it. So copying everything. And there we go. Now actually I'm going to do the same trick here again, because now I want to write the same thing in all of them. So we want to add a dot, then we can go all the way to the end, and then we can write this like this. All right, so we saved some time there, and let's now start styling them one by one here. And I will actually again start with the icon, because that's what makes these buttons here look so small right now. So we're giving them again a height and width of 24 pixels. So 24. And then, of course, the green color. So that's again using the stroke property. All right. So those are the icons. And remember that it's supposed to be this round with the green border around the button. So let's start with that actually. Border 1 pixel solid. Then let's give it some height and some width here as well. And let's make it double the one of the icons themselves. So 48 pixels. And then for the round corners, so basically to make it round, remember we use a border radius of 50%. All right, nice. Now we just need to get rid of the background color, which these buttons always have by default. And we also want to add that cursor, as always. Well, that didn't work. That's because here we actually need background, not just background color. Okay, now let's do the visual formatting of these individual links here. So that is page link. And then of course we need to add or pseudo classes, which are the link and the visited here first. And then remember also hover and visited, or actually hover and active. So let's start with the regular link styling. Let's make them a little bit bigger, 18 pixels, let's say. Then we also want the color to be our gray, so the one that we have always been using. And we want to get rid of the underlining. So that's text decoration none. And now as for the hover effect, let's again check out how that looks like. So basically there is this circle around each of the links, which then becomes green as we hover over it. Now what that means is that this circle actually needs to kind of exist already in the predefined link. So in the state before the hover, right? So let's actually do that. And as always, to make that work visually, let's give it some background color here first. And so now, of course, it's only a square. And if we hovered, or if we gave it some style now for the hover, then only that square would become green. And also the color white, since we're here already. So, right, now only the square that's around the actual element or behind the element would become green. And so we need to make that circle here at this point. So in order to do that, we give it a height and a width. So 36, which is one of the values that is in the spacing system, and the width of 36 as well. And so by this, we can ensure that it is an actual square. Now, right now, this didn't work yet because remember that by default, this is an inline element, and so therefore it's not going to work. Inline block. And so now they are squares as expected. So to inline elements, height and width does not apply, right? And so we need to change that to something else. Great. So now we have this square that we can make round. And by the way, we couldn't use padding in order to create this new space, because by doing that, we could not ensure that they would be perfect squares. But by doing this, we can. Now, we also need to center the text now inside of the squares, both horizontally and vertically, right? So, once again, what is a nice trick to do that? Well, we can do that once again using Flexbox. And I think we did this trick before. So basically using Flexbox simply to center the text that is inside of an element, both horizontally and vertically. So here actually we do not want inline block as the display property, but flex, and then here align items, center, and also justify content center. All right, there we go. Now these links here suddenly got stacked, so they're now one below the other. And that's because basically by default, a flex container is also something like a block element. So again, each of these page links here is now a flex container, right? And by default, flex containers are also like block elements. And so therefore, each of these elements now here occupies its own line. All right. So let's fix that in a moment. But in order not to jump around all the time, let's finish this part here first. So we still need to make them round. So that's border radius 50%. Right. And then we need to get rid, of course, of this background color. And so now that is actually the effect that we were going for, right? Okay. Actually, we also need the same effect here on these buttons, right? So we need to quickly implement that as well. So that is button hover. So background color this green. And now, of course, we also need to make the icon itself white. Like this, it is impossible to see, right? Now here, we need to do this. So let me write it first and then explain. So we are still interested in what happens when we hover the button here and not the button icon. And so what we want to happen is that the icon turns white when we hover the button. And so that's why we write button hover like we did before. And then as a child of that condition, basically button icon selector. And so that is where the stroke then becomes white. All right. And so that works beautifully now. So if we didn't do this, so if we simply said, we copy this, because this is actually important. So if we did this, then it would work in a quite different way. So now if we hovered only the button, then the icon would still be green. But now as we move more inward, so at some point we will hover over the icon, right? And so now that is when the icon becomes white as we want it. But only, again, once we actually hover the icon itself. So that's what we set here, right? But again, that's not the effect we are looking for. Instead, we want the icon here to become white as soon as we actually hover the button itself. So just like this, right? Okay, so the visual styling here is almost complete. Now let's finally take care of the layout. So basically putting all of these elements here side by side. So that is the pagination class. And so as expected, for that, we're going to use Flexbox. So it is a one-dimensional layout, so just a row. And so Flexbox is the right job for that. Beautiful. And now let's, of course, vertically align our items here. So align items, center. Okay. And now just to finish, we need some gap between them. And there we go. And of course, also we want to center this entire component here inside of the body as always. All right. Now here, you would have actually needed that trick that I showed you in the last lecture. So using basically Flexbox in order to center this component. That's because the trick with margin 0 auto will actually not work in this case. So that trick, remember, only works when we actually define a width on the element. So in this case, we would have to declare a width on the pagination and then use that trick of margin 0 auto. But in this case, we are not interested in actually giving this pagination a width. So the width is simply defined by basically all the width of this here added together, right? So we're not defining it, and so therefore that trick would not work. So instead, what we're going to do is to again make the body a flex container, and then justify content center. And by the way, this is not the kind of things that I expected you to also do in the coding challenge. So for the challenge, I was mainly interested that you did like this visual styling and all of that, but centering in the browser using this technique here, if you didn't do that, that's not a problem at all. Now let's just add some margin to the top here. All right, nice. So let's take a look at what's different. And so here, these dots, they need to have a different color. And then also there is basically this indication that we're on page number 3 right now. So basically an active page indicator. So let's style our dots, which are right here, right? And let's use some gray background color here. Let's say this. Not a background color, but an actual text color. Nice. And now, again, we want one of them here to look as if they were active right now. And so basically that style is exactly the same style as the hover, right? So we see that here, and it is exactly what happens when we hover. So since we already have that style written, which is this one here, we can simply reuse that. So let's add a class down here in the third one. So page link and then some sort of variation, which remember I like to use 2 dashes for that. So current. So this is the current page link. So let's copy that. And now we need to paste that right here. Okay, because once again, we already have written this style here, and so we can simply add this class to this list. And of course, we could have done it separately as well, but then we would have this code here in duplicate, and that's not what we want. However, actually, this is not going to work, and let me show you. Right? So it gave it the correct background color, but the text color itself is still coming from up here. And that's because right now, both these rules here are actually applying. So of course, this element is still a page link. So still this one here. And so that's where the text color comes from. But it is also a page link current. So that's where the background color comes from. So it uses this background color over this one here, which means that somehow this selector here gets priority over this one here. So this one. And the reason for that is a little bit complicated, but if we hover over it, you will see here that it says selector specificity 0 to 0, right? And down here, it says 0, 1, 0. And so that 2 here is higher, and so that's why this applies. And if you're interested in why this is 2, well, the quick reason is that here, this selector does actually have 2 classes or pseudo classes. So this is 1, and this is 2. And so that's why we have that 2. And here we only have 1. And so that's where this 1 comes from. However, we want this here to be applied always, right? So we want actually the color to be white as well. And so we need to make that the specificity is also 2 here. So what we can do is to use a new selector, which is basically the end selector. So let me write that here. And again, of course, this is not the kind of things that you could have figured out by yourself in the coding challenge, right? So basically, if we write this, but without the space here, that's very important, then that means that this only applies when the element has this selector and also this one. Okay? So again, this is the AND selector, and it only applies to an element if it has both of these classes. So in this case, it does have page link and also page link current. Okay, and so very important, not the space. So with the space, it is a descendant selector, but without the space, it is an AND selector. So again, AND meaning that the element has both this class and this class. And so now the selector has two classes, and when we hover it, we see that 2 here. And so now both of them have 2, and so in that case, the one that is last is the one that applies. And so now you see that it turned white. All right, so this part, I admit, is a bit confusing. So maybe go back a little bit and listen to my explanation again, because this can be a source of confusion when you write your own code. And then in some situation, you might not really understand what is going on. Just remember that I showed you in one of the first sections the priority between these selectors. So between ID selectors and class selectors and element selectors. But there we didn't talk about this notion of specificity. And I still don't want to go deep into that. But I just want you to use basically VS Code here as a help. And so whenever you have one selector that has a lower value here in one of these points, then that is the one that will not get applied. So the one with the higher value is the one that gets applied. Okay, and again, now both here are at 2, so 0, 2, 0, and then it is the last of the 2 that gets applied. So if we change this here to the top, then it would still not work. So only now, because it is the last one, is the reason why it works. And I think with this, we actually finished this component. Yep, everything works nicely. And so that is it. So everything works nicely. And so our work is done here.
Subscribe Henry Codes to learn from paid web development courses for free and earn money.